Welcome to this, the 23rd episode of the YAHOWAH blog on Qatsyr harvest. This is the story of Shabuah leading to Towrah. It is the outcome of Bikurim, representing the three harvests of YAHOWAH during the Moed Mikre. As we know, in his first of three lives, the actual Messiah and Son of God, David, decided that it was in everyone's interest, including even his, but of course in God's and in ours, for him to volunteer to serve as the Pesach El, as the Zeroah, the sacrificial lamb of Passover. He not only did so, opening the doorway to life and to God's home through the sacrifice of his bashar, corporeal body, on this day, on Passover, in year 4000 33 CE, 1,000 years after, he wrote the prophetic portrait of precisely what he would endure. He also agreed to fulfill matzah, with his nefesh soul burdened with our guilt and carrying it into Sheol, so that we might be perfect in God's presence. Because in Sheol, our guilt becomes invisible, never to be seen again. This enabled Dod to rejoin his father. Dod is the one man of whom God said, "He is my son, I am his father." And he said it to him three times, symbolic of these three lives. And on Bikurim, he became the Bakor, the firstborn son of the firstborn children of the covenant. And it is through the fulfillment of the first three Moed Mikre, in particular the harvest of Bikurim, where we are adopted into Yahweh's family, enriched and empowered by him, that we are prepared for the Shabuah harvest, which is still on our horizon. Shabuah will be fulfilled 7 years prior to Dod and Yahweh's return, which means that it will be the Shabat of sevens, 7 years before year 6000 which is 2033, making it the Shabat of May 22nd of 2026. This will also be the beginning of the time of Israel's troubles. Upon this harvest, we will not only endure this horrible time for God's people, but it will come to a conclusion at the final harvest, that of Towrah, which will also be celebrated on a Shabbat, the Towrah of September 23rd and 24th in year 2033, which is year 6000 the 120th Yobel, since mankind was escorted out of the Garden of Great Joy. On this day, there will be the sacrifice of the Adamah Parah, of the bloody red man of the earth who has been fruitful. He is the man from Edom, of whom the prophet Yeshayah spoke. And he will prepare this remaining remnant, the mortal survivors of Yisrael, these Yehudim, for the return of their king, our king, the Messiah and Son of God, Dod, who will arrive to anoint the mercy seat in accordance with the Torah of the Ark of the Covenant on Yom Kippurim in year 6000 2033, which means this will be accomplished by Dod on sunset, 6:22 p.m. in Yisrael, particularly on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, October 2nd, 2033. This will then enable all of those who remain to not only be washed in the floodwaters that will cascade off the Temple Mount and the searing and purging fire of the flames rising from the Adamah Parah, to be prepared to enter a planet now that has been returned to the conditions experienced in Gan Eden and celebrate the next 1,000 years here on earth, camping out with our Heavenly Father. And so this program is devoted, as were the 22 prior to it, and the 20-some that will follow, to the Shabuah harvest, so that you know as much about it as is possible and can participate in it with us. Now, picking up where we left off in our last episode, the following invitation was for one, but Moshe did not stand alone. Yosha, which has been transliterated very crudely to Joshua, would ultimately assist Moshe, which is an example that we may also want to emulate when it comes to those God has chosen to communicate through. So Moshe and Yahosha. Yahosha means Yahweh frees, delivers, and saves. He is the son of Nun, of the tribe of Ephraim, the one assisting him, the one attending to him and associating as a helper to serve him, stood up, rose, standing upright, and Moshe, the one who draws out, ascended toward the mountain of God. Now, the change here from Aaron, the alternative, to Yosha, Yahweh saves, is noteworthy. At this juncture, it was the beginning of a rift which Aaron would live up to his dubious name. As proof, he would not only stay behind with the elders, he would also join them in digging a tremendous hole for themselves. Then the elders, he said, "It is your decision to remain and wait for us right here until we return to you with the everlasting testimony regarding the benefits of the relationship. Take note, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever Baal, the Lord, speaks, let him approach them." Shemoth names Exodus 24:14. This is the preeminent contrast regarding the ultimate promotion and demotion. Moshe would take a stand with Yosha to ascend to Yahweh to receive the Torah. All the while, the alternative would use his free will in direct concert with the elders while listening to the Lord Baal, who is the adversary. It is largely why Aaron is on the wrong side of most everything. Aaron represents the very worst of Yisrael, while Moshe, clearly not perfect, represents the best of Yisrael. So then Moshe climbed up upon the mountain, even though the mountain was covered in a cloud. Shemoth 24:15. Then the glorious presence and the splendor of Yahweh came to dwell upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered and adorned it for 6 days. And on the seventh day, he called out to Moshe from the midst of the cloud. Shemoth names Exodus 24:16. When we hear things like this, we learn that Yahweh was intent to reveal, not conceal himself. So we ought to consider the reasons his presence was veiled at the moment, particularly during those first 6 days. First, there is a realization that this meeting was scheduled to be a private affair with Moshe. It would have defeated the purpose had there been a million prying eyes from the beginning. Likewise, Yahweh did not want to witness the upcoming behavior of his people. It would be horrendous and it would never change. He had withdrawn from Mitzrayim, his people. He had taken them out of slavery, especially as they began to convert with the adversary. It was extremely frustrating to God. The putrid scene would have been both irritating and distracting. The longer it could be ignored, well, the better. Third, all things should occur in the right order and the correct time. God had overwhelmed the children of Israel with fireworks on top of the mountain before he began to convey the means to know him as their father, their teacher, and their guide. And he would have come across as just another unapproachable and fearsome God if it had all been fire and smoke. And the fourth, this approach not only helped convey the metaphors we will consider in just a moment, but also provided the opportunity for Yahweh to prepare Moshe for the most extraordinary moment in history. He would soak it in for 6 days prior to Yahweh providing the ultimate data download. The entire episode would be a learning experience because mankind would not come to embrace Yahweh's testimony for the 6,000 years between our expulsion from the garden and return to it in the seventh. This said, Yahweh would not be hidden long. He still recognized that it was necessary for the children of Israel to see that Moshe was receiving the tablets, the Torah, and the covenant's instructions directly from our Creator. And cutting through the fog, let's be clear, the kabod, the glorious presence and splendor of Yahweh, was a manifestation of his power and an attribution to his honorable characteristics, revealing his tremendous significance, not only to the universe, but to our lives as well. It was not only the full extent of, this could not have been, and we've talked about this before, the full extent of Yahweh, not even close. Yahweh is infinitely too massive, powerful to enter 6 dimensions, much less 3. This is one of the reasons that Yahweh uses implements, people, where he projects his nephesh soul, a malach, spiritual entities through he can interact and convey with us, and sometimes even his ruach spirit to make his presence known, to convey his nature and interact with his creation. Sinai is spelled Shemek Yod, Nun Yod. The graphic intent of these letters reads, "My sign I am giving to my children." My sign I am giving to my children. In the process of trying to ascertain the meaning of Sinai, I came upon something I thought was interesting. Siwan, which means their covering, is also the name of the 3rd month of the Torah year. It therefore corresponds to the Mikra of Shabuah, which is in May or June, 7 sevens from Bakurim. This is a subtlety that suggests that the Torah was indeed revealed during Shabuah, as it spoke of Yahweh's plan of 7s. While we're not told explicitly, every indication is that the unveiling of the Torah and the celebration of Shabuah during the Yatzah were concurrent events. It was even underscored by this example, where it was the 7th day that Yahweh's presence was made known, because Shabuah means 7. It is the Torah, after all, which fulfills its promises, enriching and enhancing the children of the covenant, empowering and enlightening us tenfold. Further, the Feast of Sevens, like the mountain during Moshe's ascent, is all about being covered, adorned, and clothed in Yahweh's glorious presence. Therefore, this correlation between Sinai and the month of Siwan suggests that the first installation of the Torah corresponds to the timing of Shavuot, where we know that Passover was celebrated in Mitzrayim, and it opened the doorway to life for the firstborn of God's children. And that on Matzah, the children of Israel first separated themselves from the religious and political cauldron of Egypt. And it is therefore symbolizing this very same thing in our lives, where we are disassociated from the corruption, the control, the influence, the death and damnation of religion and politics. And then Bikurim is symbolized along the way of walking through the waters and then emerging on the other side as children born into the covenant family, so that this would be the fourth of the 7 steps to Yahweh, and the one that would have been celebrated with this installment of the Torah. The purpose of this set-apart spirit, should she have been present in this, is to adorn us in Yahweh's glory. Thereby, it serves as a means for us to project God's nature. The spirit, Ruach, isn't shared with many. In this particular case, Moshe may have been the first to receive it. We're not told specifically that he did, but when he complained bitterly to Yahweh about the children of Israel being obstinate and being ungrateful, and far worse than that, Yahweh just says they're worthless riffraff. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it because the promise he had made to Abraham and through the covenant. That when he said that, Yahweh said that he would share the spirit that had been offered to Moshe with the 70 elders that would share the burden of leading the wayward children through the wilderness and eventually home. So Moshe may have been the first to experience the spirit. It is most adroitly associated with David, when at 8 years old, Yahweh told us that he was his chosen one, and that he not only wanted him anointed as the Messiah, but at that time the spirit, the Ruach of Yahweh, came upon David and never left him. The most prolific application of Yahweh's spirit would be yet to come. It would follow David's application by nearly 3,000 years. And again, it's the great prophet Yeshayah that tells us about it in the 11th chapter, where he explains that the choder, the stem off the main branch, which is David, the sucker that is giving new life to the fallen stump that is Yisrael, would be empowered and enriched, guided, emboldened, enabled by the 7 spirits of Yahweh. And so it is a means that Yahweh has to empower us. So returning to the timing of 6 days of preparation followed by the summons on the 7th, there is an insight here that few have considered. There was no indication that either Yahweh or Moshe engaged doing any work during the initial 6 days. It was not until the 7th day that they began the long process of educating and guiding humankind. This realization affirms the interpretation of the Shabat that I have presented throughout the volumes of Yada Yahowah and on the Yahowah blog. The Shabat, rather than do nothing day, as religious rabbis would have everyone believe, with it becoming the most onerous day of the week because there's 1,000 ways that you have to be assured that you are doing nothing correctly. It is actually the time to do something. something really extraordinary, and that is to celebrate our relationship with Yahweh by reading the very same Torah that he presented to Moshe at this moment in time. Throughout most of the 23 years that I have served Yahweh in this mission as his choder, the coal voice of God, as his son's Bashar Herald, I have devoted the Shabbat to study. I do what Moshe and Yahweh have done. And I've also noticed that God does his best work on the Shabbat, just as is in the case here. Yahweh doesn't do things that he does not want us to emulate. And so here he is teaching and guiding on the Shabbat. And it is on the Shabbat of Shabuah and the Shabbat of Towrah that God will perform mightily on behalf of his people. And our camping experience with Yahweh begins on a Shabbat of Sukkah. In fact, even to the announcement of a full eclipse of the moon in year 6000 Yah, October 7th of that year. And the most difficult work that Yahweh ever did, he accomplished with his son, also on a natural Shabbat, the special Shabbat of Matzah, when his son was laden with our guilt and carried our guilt into Sheol to deposit it there, never to be seen again. So don't think for a moment that the Shabbat is do-nothing day. It is the day that we are devoted to celebrating and advancing our relationship with Almighty God. The most similar thing to Yahweh in our realm, as we have discussed previously, is light. And as such, he was seen on this occasion as light. The appearance of the manifestation of power and glorious presence of Yahweh was similar to consuming fire, flames of radiant energy as a source of light within the summit of the mountain from the point of view and perspective of the children of Yisrael. Fire is a form of radiant energy and light. Fire, though, has a number of symbolic and actually scientific attributes that are applicable to our understanding of God. First, as light, as radiant energy, Yahweh is represented as spirit as opposed to being a material being. Second, as light, Yahweh would be eternal, as light represents all time simultaneously. As light, Yahweh would be able to witness our future and our past and report back to us future history, which is how prophecy occurs. As light, Yahweh would be, immeasurably more energetic than we are currently as material beings. As light, Yahweh was illuminating, giving us the ability to be observant. He was also enlightening. And as fire, fire is that form of radiant energy which consumes decaying organic material and transforms it into energy, which is the very thing that Yahweh is offering to us on Shabuah, again on Towrah, transforming us from material beings, very limited in our capability, imperfect, and also decaying, to eternal beings who are greatly empowered and enabled. This is why Yahweh uses light as a metaphor. Kabod in this statement, and that was used to convey manifestation of power and the glorious presence of Yahweh, is based upon kabod, which is the operative term of the second of 7 instructions that Yahweh etched on the on the second of the 2 tablets, and that it means significant, honorable, glorious. It provides an important insight into the identity of the father and mother we are to view as significant, since the instruction cannot pertain to our earthly parents, because in the second statement on the first tablet, Yahweh already stated that fathers corrupt their sons to the 3rd and 4th generation. So this father and mother who are bound to the Adamah, the earth, the very ground that we stand upon, that are massively important to us, particularly that God's people would understand at this time as Bereshith was revealed to them, would have been Abraham and Sarah as the mother and father of the covenant that Yahweh was inviting his children to participate in. Now, you will also notice that the fire wasn't coming from a burning bush, but instead the rocky summit of this barren mountain. This provides additional credibility to my consistent translation of Sinai as a high rocky crag, not a burning bush. Moreover, the summit of Mount Sinai, known today as Jabal Makla, the burnt mountain, still reveals the consequence of God's presence. And it's, as an interesting aside, in Hebrew, Miklah means complete perfection. It's funny that Jabal is Arabic, and Makla is Arabic as well, and Arabic is really nothing more than bastardized Hebrew. The entire Quran is revealed in Hebrew, twisted and bastardized into Arabic. And so if you really want to understand what it says, you really have to have an appreciation for Hebrew. And in this particular case, the basis of the Arabic word for burnt is makla, which is the Hebrew word for complete perfection. And I find that delightful because, of course, with Allah being Hasatan, the thing he really wants to do is burn up everything that would lead us to see Yahweh and his presence as perfecting. With Yahweh conveying his presence through the Ish, the fire, in the midst of this meeting to reveal his Torah, it is only natural for us to see the material, the feminine manifestation of Yahweh's Isha as the aspect of God's presence that we should approach during the Mikra. And so this is reassuring regarding those translations that I have already shared with you. At this point, Moshe was enveloped within Yahweh's light, while the children of Israel saw it from afar. It was their response to God's instructions and invitations which set them apart. The same distinction exists between covenant members and the rest of the world today. As such, there is yet another insight worthy of our attention. Knowing that God exists is not sufficient to be with him. This renders faith moot. Trekking a little higher on the mountain on Shabuah, we discover Moshe, the one who draws out, entered. He pursued, came to, arrived, and was included into the midst of the water vapor cloud. And he ascended higher upon the mountain. And then Moshe was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So in the two numbers that have been shared with us, 6 plus 1, I guess that's 2 by itself, equals 7, and now 40. We really have the ability now, if you're thinking things all the way through, to assign the 7 Mikra and their fulfillment to important days that are distinct and separated by a factor of 40, with 6 leading to the 7th. So this would tell us that the first 6 Moed Mikre, Pesach, Matzah, and Bakurim, then Shabuah, Towrah, and Kippurim lead to Sukkah. Sukkah is our return to the garden. And that therefore our time in Eden to the time that we re-enter Eden should be 6,000 years, so we can spend the 7th with Yahweh in the return to Eden during Sukkah. So all of this would play out over that period of time. And therefore, we would expect our re-entry into the garden, and therefore the fulfillment of the final 3 Moed Mikre, to take place in year 6,000 Yah, so that we could celebrate from 6,000 to 7,000 Yah with Yahweh. And then we should expect that the time between the rest of the Moed Mikre being fulfilled would be separated by a factor of 40. 40 what would be the question? Well, we're told here that this is a celebration of Shabuah. What is Shabuah? Shabuah is 7 times 7 plus 1. 7 times 7 plus 1 is 50. There's something else in Yahweh's vocabulary that also follows the pattern of 7 times 7 plus 1 equals 50. That's the Yobel. The Yobel is the time that all slaves are emancipated, freed. We are freed, emancipated by God, which is the first statement that Yahweh etched in stone. It is the time that all of our debts are forgiven. Well, this is what occurs on Matzah as Dode carried our debts into Sheol and deposited them there, never to be seen again. And then we all return to the land, which is, of course, symbolic of Sukkah, where we camp out with Yahweh for 1,000 years. So if you take the pattern of Shabuah and of the Yobel, and you apply this 40 designation to it, if you go 40 times 50, from the time that we were exiled from the Garden of Eden, which is the beginning of this period of 6 plus 1, that would place it at 3968 BCE. If you add 40 Yobel or 40 Shabuah to that time, you arrive at 1968 BCE, which is the time that the Torah tells us that Abraham and Yishak climbed up Mount Moriah to celebrate the first harbinger of Pesach, Passover, where God, in a context of father and son, said that he would provide the lamb. From that point, if we add 40 Yobel or 40 Shabuah to that date in 1968 BCE, we arrive at 33 CE. And before you say, well, that math doesn't work, you're off by 1 year, guess what? The dunderheads of Roman Catholicism, when they put together their calendar from 1 BCE to 1 CE, rather than being 2 years, was 1 year, they forgot the year 0. So it actually is exactly 40 Yobel. So that would make 3968 BCE, when we're expelled from the garden, year 0 Yah. 1968 BCE, when Abraham and Yishak confirmed the covenant narrative and served as the dress rehearsal for Pesach, Passover, that would be year 2000 Yah. Year 4000 Yah is then 33 CE. This would be when Dode, in his second of 3 lives, fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Bakurim. Now you can do the math. What is 40 Shabuah? What is 40 Yobel from 33 CE? Correct. 2033. That is why 2033 is year 6,000 Yah. That is when Towrah and Kippurim, followed by Sukkah, will be fulfilled. All in year 6,000 Yah. So, we can learn a lot when we think it through. When we go from knowing Yada to understanding Bien by making these connections. And that is a large part of this, the YAHOWAH blog. I want you not only to know what God said, what he's offering, what he expects in return, who did what to whom and when. I want you to understand it, everything. Because once you understand, the material becomes literally integrated into you. You can do what I'm doing now. After coming to know all of this and writing it in these 35 books that sit behind me on this bookshelf and are free to you at yadayah.com, I became the living embodiment of those books and all of that knowledge by making the connections to understand. Because when we understand, we can do things like turn on these lights, look the camera in the lens, and speak to you through this mic, and do so much of it extemporaneously so that we can reintroduce you to Yahweh's name, so that I can reacquaint you with your Messiah and the Son of God, to Dode David, your returning King, so that I can acquaint you with God's timeline, so that you know when the Shabuah harvest will begin, when the time of Jacob's troubles commence, when they end, when the final harvest will transpire, when Dode will return with Yahweh to anoint the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, such that all evil is expunged from the earth, and we return to the conditions found in the Gan Eden on Sukkah. This is the purpose of the YAHOWAH blog. And then Moshe was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Shemot names, Exodus 24:8. If Yahweh could have summarized his Torah teaching such that it was reduced to a handful of bullet points, a PowerPoint presentation, Moshe would not have been on the mountain this long. If his Torah guidance could have been condensed to the length of an average 20-minute sermon, God would have done so. The very fact that Moshe was there 40 days and 40 nights speaks volumes about how much there was to learn, and therefore how much there is for us to learn, to know and understand, and realize that for the most part, what Yahweh was conveying to Moshe is Barashith. The rest of it they would experience together as we move into Shemot names, through Kara, invitations, into the frustrations of Bamidbar in the wilderness, and then to the enlightenment of Devarim words. Well, 40, as I have just shared, is the number that Yahweh has designated as the time required for the completion of an important event, a phase or an era. For example, as I have shared, 40 Yobel, 2,000 years, it's also 40 Shabuah, transpired from being expelled from Gan Eden to the conception of the covenant's narrative with Abraham, Sarah, and Yishak in 1968 BCE. Another 40 Yobel would pass from that day to the fulfillment of the promises in 33 CE. The final 40 Yobel and Shabuah will have run their course upon Yahweh's return with his son in 2033 CE, year 6000 Yah. Moshe's life represents this pattern. Even his life, yes. He was 40 years old when he fled Mitzrayim after trying to protect Hebrews from the evils of the Egyptian political system and religion. He was 80 upon his return as the liberator of his people. And he would lead them another 40 years, reaching 120 years old at the conclusion of his mortal existence. He, like Dowd, had lived 3 lives. One as a prince in Mitzrayim, once as a shepherd in Arabia, and the third as Yahweh's messenger and prophet and liberator. He was an exceptional man, and his was an exceptional life. It established the pattern for the one that he spoke of in Devarim 18, the one like him who would come from your midst, David, who would also live 3 lives, very distinctly different lives. Before we leave this instruction from Yahweh, I would like to offer a final thought. This passage on the Mikra, the Torah, and the covenant confirms that the Moed, including Shabuah, have nothing to do with the Jewish religion, but instead lead to the familial covenant relationship. Yahweh established with Abraham, and he explained through Moshe and enabled this through Dowd. There is but one path to God, one set of instructions, and just one family. It is with considerable trepidation that we now venture into the pages of the Christian New Testament. And I'm going here, and I'll begin this in this program, and we'll pick it up in future programs, because we must. It's not because it's inspired. It isn't. It's rubbish. But when it comes to appreciating what Shabuah represents and this opportunity for Yahweh to harvest his covenant family and not only remove his children before the worst of the time of Jacob's troubles, but also to prepare members of his family to be even more effective over the last 7 years as Israel is besieged on every side. And the reason here is that the Christian religion did many things that were exceedingly harmful. And in the case of Shabuah, they claimed it as their own. They renamed it, of course, calling it Pentecost. They repurposed it, and as rather than a harvest, which is the removal of the covenant's children, it became the birth of their God-forsaken church. Something, of course, that Yahweh never addresses, never speaks of, doesn't have one. There is no correlation between God and a church. And to make this seem somewhat credible, Peter, who is the one who is the narrator of this bit of replacement foolology, would make an utter fool of himself and misappropriate the prophets. And one of the prophets that he misappropriates is Yoel, who is germane to our understanding if we want to have an appreciation of what Shabuah represents and where it leads. Christianity, and the reason we have to excoriate it, also piled its rubbish right on top of the most important truth in all of human history. You see, the actual Son of God, the Messiah, The returning king, our Savior, is David. And the Christian religion, as conceived by Paul, is nothing but a counterfeit. His Iousu Christou is a mythological misnomer, serving as nothing more than a crude counterfeit of everything David represents and achieved. And because of them piling this demonic rubbish right on top of the truth, stealing what belongs to God and to his people, and then claiming all of the promises that Yahweh offered to his people, Yisrael and Yehudim, for a goddamn Goyim church. If this rubbish is not removed, it is nigh on impossible for God's people to know the truth, because they know that that lie stinks to high heaven. They know that that lie was used to abuse them, to demonize them, to dehumanize them, to isolate them as essential slaves who had no rights in ghettos throughout the Holy Roman Empire by the Roman Catholic Church. And it led directly to the Holocaust. And so they don't want to go anywhere near it. But if you don't push it all aside and look what was buried underneath it, then there is no hope of salvation, because Dod's role as the actual Messiah, as the actual Son of God, as the one who actually fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Bakurim, is unknown, as is Yahweh's name, his Father. So we must hold our nose. We must do this dirty job. Because if we don't, the truth remains buried. And there is no fulfillment of Shabuah. There is no fulfillment of Towrah. There is no homecoming on Kippurim. And there is no celebration on Sukkah. God's people would not know the truth without us doing this job. So we are going to excoriate the Christian New Testament. We are going to spit it out as vomit. If you think that Eliah was demeaning and sarcastic as he attacked the Lord and the Queen of Heaven and the Mother of God, symbolized now by the Roman Catholic Church, 2,880 years ago, you ain't seen nothing yet. So, we're going to venture into the Christian New Testament. And yet it is Shimon Peter's preposterous position that he witnessed the fulfillment of Shabuah in 33 CE as the fantasy was scribed by Luke in the book of Acts, that is worth the risk of our diversion, because it is so demonstrative of religious corruption and how readily the preponderance of people are led astray, and how the truth becomes so uncommon that for the 2,000 years after this was fulfilled, no one, not a single person, knew what actually occurred. Not one. Had there actually been disciples, and the likelihood is that there were none, had any of their stories been true, and the likelihood is they were not, one would have expected that, having lived alongside the Zeroah, a title that is the Dod's most important that not a single Christian knows. It means sacrificial lamb. It is also the one who is cultivating the seeds of these harvests. for 3 years, and having been in Jerusalem during Dod's fulfillment of Pesach, Matzah, and Bekurim, the likes of a Shimon, the actual name for the person that was renamed Rock or Peter, would have been prepared by the first 3 Mikre, at least to the point to understand the purpose and timing of the 4th of Shabuah. The alleged witness should he actually have existed, would have been in the right place at the right time, and therefore should have been able to articulate an accurate accounting of what occurred during the promise of 7 in year 4,000 Yah. But he didn't. Had the person known as Peter today been paying attention, he would have been a beneficiary of Pesach, unyeasted bread, and firstborn children, and thus sufficiently enlightened by the process and empowered to know that it was a non-event, that Shabuah was not fulfilled in year 33 CE. In fact, it would be fulfilled as a harvest of standing grain almost 2,000 years from this date. As a matter of fact, 2,000 minus 7, 1,993 years distant from this time. This would place the ingathering of the covenant family, of course, on May 22nd, 2026, which is a scant 1,993 years distant from Peter's proclamation. It's a little screw up among a few billion people, right? In the opening line of the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts, there is the absurd notion that the Mikra of Shabuah was fulfilled in accordance with some previous standard or prediction. But that's not even remotely possible, since 7 Shabbats is a harvest of Bekurim, of firstborn children. And they are the offspring of Pesach, Passover, and Matzah, unyeasted bread. And since the Christian New Testament disavows the first 3 Mikre as fulfilled by Dod, they cannot rationally acknowledge or benefit from the 4th. It tells us implicitly that Shabuah is a harvest of Bekurim, and Bekurim is the result of Pesach and Matzah. You have to be completely ignorant or irrational or just plain out deceitful to convey otherwise. It's akin, the Christian position is akin to jumping in a car, but forgetting to build the chassis, or adding the engine, or including tires. And since Christians deny the concluding Moedim, there would be no seats, steering wheel, or pedals. This vehicle of faith was comprised solely of a gear shift, and it was stuck in reverse. This known, we are painfully aware that Acts, like the Gospel of Luke, was a work of fiction, overwhelmingly wrong, and almost never right. Neither book, Acts or Luke, was inspired by God or the facts, for that matter. Both presentations are hearsay, which means they wouldn't even be admissible in a court of law trying to determine who gets the family dog in a divorce. However, sorry about that, Asher. I didn't mean to demean you. However, since they are considered a scripture by billions and influence their lives and culture, these books, which were scribed at the conclusion of the lifetimes of Paul's associates, are seldom scrutinized as I have done and will continue to do. And that is a shame, because it becomes immediately obvious to an informed and rational reader that they were agenda driven. More specifically, heavily influenced by Shaul Paul, the plague of death. In fact, he was the one who inspired all of them. He wrote the first 14 books of the Christian New Testament. And 3 of the 4 Gospels were nothing more than the work of those under his employ or inspiration. The resulting message has haunted God's people, and for centuries. By having claimed Shavuot as if it were Pentecost, Christians have concealed the truth under a swamp of lies, although that's not fair to a swamp. Cesspool might be a more adroit term. The visibility issue becomes readily apparent when the book of Acts or the Gospel of Luke, because they're both riddled with inaccuracies, fallacies, and worse, anti-Semitism, as well as countless misappropriations and misinterpretations of the prophets, are properly scrutinized. It is only because the first 7 chapters of Acts present events and discussions apart from Paul and purport to convey the testimony of a disciple that any of this is being conveyed for your consideration, and also because by excoriating a religion born out of a hatred of Jews, there's something that can be done that enhances the security going forward of God's people. With this in mind, I'll begin by sharing something from the 2nd chapter of Acts, and before long we will conclude to this program and pick up this theme in a future episode. Indeed, on the day of 50, Pentecoste, it was fulfilled. It came to exist that all who were assembled in harmony in the presence of it. Acts 2:1. It's bull excrement. The day of Shavuot is going to be fulfilled 15 months from now, on the Shabat, 7 years prior to Yahweh and Dod's return, as the name sevens implies. It is a harvest, which means it is an ingathering, a withdrawal of God's children. It did not occur in 33 CE. In 33 CE, what they should have acknowledged, if anyone was actually speaking for God, if they had read the Torah and prophets, and particularly the Mizmor of Dod, they would have known that the thing worth declaring was Dod as the Messiah and Son of God's fulfillment of Pesach, Matzah, and Bakurim. But no. In the replacement foolology of Christianity, they began with 50, Pentecoste. I would like you to look up and tell me how many references there were prophetically to Pentecoste in the Torah and prophets. I'll give you, what do you need? A minute? 10? An hour? A day? A week? A year? What do you want? I want you to find every reference, since it was such an important day and it was fulfilled, which means that there was a promise of it that was honored at this time, requiring there have been a mention and a promise of it back in time. Go find it for me.
0.
You could spend all of the 2,000 years that have transpired and you couldn't find one, because guess what? There are none. Therefore, it could not have been fulfilled, because there was no promise regarding a Pentecoste. And even the prophecies that are provided on Shavuot tell us that it had nothing to do with the Christian church, and it didn't occur in 33 CE, and that it is pursuant to God's people, not Gentiles. and that its timing is 7 years, as the name implies, before Yahweh's return. And we begin the 7th millennia. 7 sevens. No, it did not come to exist, and there was no one gathered in harmony with the fulfillment of a Pentecoste, much less Shabuah. They weren't even gathered in harmony with the fulfillment of Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim, which had occurred. So I know, and it's embarrassing to say this, really, for humankind, that I was the first to explain that there was actually nothing fulfilled on Pentecost Day. In fact, there was no Pentecost Day to fulfill. Further, the clown providing the narration, if I can be so kind to Luke and so demeaning to clowns, was completely unfamiliar with Yahowah. He did not know Dode. He did not know the Torah. He was completely unfamiliar with the prophets. He would not have known a mikra if it kissed him on both cheeks. Obviously. This is nothing more than a crude ripoff of Shabuah by a counterfeit title for a counterfeit religion with a counterfeit Messiah. It is a harvest, not an assembly. There is no harmony because it is a day of diversity. Yahweh's intent is that those gathered on Shabuah would be varied in their life situations by their gender, by their age. It is a harvest of varieties of wheat, standing and mature, who are comprised of Bikurim, firstborn children. The bread representing the harvest, these 2 loaves, are brought out of the house of Yisrael, and therefore would represent Yisraelites and Yehudim. And its annual observance, it is the Mikra where Yahweh wanted a reasonably broad audience to hear his message and the experience, understand Yahweh's passion for this experience of this remarkable harvest, where there is a second tenfold increase in our ability and capabilities, our overall influence, power, and efficacy. Done correctly, the attendees would be like-minded, similarly devoted, but it, as in Shabuah, does not have a presence. When the foretold fulfillment of the Shabuah Qatsyr means harvest. Shabuah, of course, is either the promise of the Shabat or 7 sevens. Transpires on May 22nd, 2026, as the sun sets on the Shabat. The time of Yisrael's troubles will intensify as the planet enters the 7-year countdown to Yahweh's return with David, not Jesus. There will be no Christians participating among the 1 in a million who will be withdrawn. Peter's perverse ploy was particularly disappointing. He is pretending to benefit from, orchestrate, and explain Shabuah without even mentioning Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim, which are prerequisites. I just want to continue to emphasize this. God was explicit that Bikurim is the result of Pesach and Matzah. If you have not observed Pesach, which opens the doorway to life, and Matzah, where Dode removed our guilt and deposited it in Sheol, making us appear perfect before God, you cannot Bikurim. which has become a child of the covenant. And without Bokurim, there is no Shabuah, because Shabuah is a Bokurim harvest. So to begin at Shabuah is like saying, I'm going to read a novel, and I don't want to waste my time with the first 200 pages. So of the 400-page novel, I'm going to start on page 201. Well, Shabuah is the middle of 7 Moedim. And the other 6 play no role in the upstart religion of Christianity. So it is irrational to claim 7 sevens for a faith at war with the Torah. There is no other place where the meaning and purpose of the promise of 7 are depicted. As a result, to disingenuously pilfer the middle mikre, that's the center candle of that menorah over my shoulder, and ignorantly and incorrectly describe it while claiming it as a spiritual awakening is appalling. But apparently not to Christians who celebrate Pentecost to this day as if it were announcing the birth of their church. And while we're at it, why don't you look up and see where you can find a reference to a church in the Torah, prophets, and Psalms? Since this is the end all and the ultimate of the religion of Christianity, the most popular religion in the world that claims that it was foretold in the Torah and in the prophets, why don't you find a reference to church for me? I'll wait. I've got all the time in the universe. I'm already guaranteed of eternal life. I'll wait for you as long as you'd like. Although, looking at my timepiece, you have exactly 8.5 years left if you survive the time of Jacob's troubles, which most of you won't. Shall we continue? Are you willing to admit there is no reference whatsoever to a church anywhere in the Torah and prophets? And since there's no reference to a church, and since that's the central focus of the Christian religion, are you willing to admit that you have nothing to do with the God of the Torah and prophets? Why don't you find Christian? Why don't you find Christ? Why don't you find your Trinity? Why don't you find any of these things? Why don't you find a goddamn torture stick as a cross? Man, I'll wait. I mean, whatever time you need to look up these things, because they're essential to the religion of Christianity, and there's no mention of them in the Torah and prophets, and yet you said the same God inspired your religion. How's that possible? I'll read this next line and we'll end this program and pick it up in our next. And if you don't like this tone, you aren't going to like these programs. But you know, I'm not doing it to save Christians. Most people of faith are too irrational for evidence and reason, which is all I have to offer. I'm doing this not to save Christians, but to clear away the Christian rubbish so that God's people, Israel and Yahudah, might know and feel comfortable embracing the truth about who David actually is as the Messiah and the Son of God, and how he fulfilled the Moed Mikre. And immediately there came into existence out of heaven the sound of information and news, echoes like a compelling force moving inwardly and upholding the breath of spiritual life and fulfilling the whole household where we were residing. Acts 2:2. I'll just share a thought or two and then we'll conclude this program. There is no immediately associated with Shabuah. from the fulfillment of Bikurim to the fulfillment of Shabuah is 1,993 years. Nothing comes into existence on Shabuah, but some lives will leave the material existence we know here on earth. Just the opposite. Something will not come out of heaven on this day, but will go into heaven on this day. Peter had it backwards. There will not be the sound of information and news on this day echoes, because the Bashar, who is the herald of Yahweh, and his son Dod, the Kol, voice of Yahweh, the Choder giving new life to the fallen stump of Yisrael, the Nakar, who is the observant and responsive foreigner, the final Zeroah, who is cultivating this harvest, will be withdrawn. We will provide episodes of the Yahowah blog daily, right up to this moment. But on this moment, rather than information and news, sound, a voice coming out of heaven, it will be sequestered. All you will have is the legacy of these programs. The voice of God never compels. There is no compelling force. God offers you the opportunity to choose to be with him or reject him. Free will is sacrosanct, meaning the compelling force is again the antithesis of what's true. Nothing moves inwardly at this moment, but instead upwardly. There is no breath of spiritual life. As a matter of fact, phony, feminine derivative of pneuma, spirit, is not even spoken of, addressed in the fulfillment of Shabuah. And it says the whole household that was filled where they were residing, if this was the fulfillment of Shabuah, and they had been the beneficiaries of Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim, the whole household, rather than being filled where they were residing, would be empty. Every single word presented as a confirmation of the Christian fulfillment of Pentecoste. Every single word was wrong. And that's tough. It's tough to string together this many words and have every single one of them being the antithesis of the truth. And yet they managed to do it. That takes talent. It means it was purposefully contrived. That's not an accident. Billions of people who have been deliberately deceived, while the truth was buried and kept from Yahweh's children. This has been an episode of the Yahowah blog. I appreciate you inviting me into your homes and for this opportunity to share with you. I am Craig Winn.